We're going to be looking verse 26 through 39 as the whole thing is tied together here because Paul is writing to us about the suffering that we go through in life and what causes the Christian to be able to overcome that suffering. And the first thing that he shared with us back in verse 18 is the idea of hope, that we have hope that the world does not have. Okay? The second thing that Paul shared with us in verses 26 and 27 is that we have the Holy Spirit that intercedes for us, that he is there helping us to realize what God's will really is. And finally, we come to this point, okay? And he's going to talk about the certainty that we have as a Christian. You know, there's a little girl that was, I'm going to go ahead and go, well, not yet. I've got the slides out of order, I know I do. So, anyway. There's this little girl that's riding her bicycle. And as she's going down the sidewalk, there's a low-hanging branch, and she hits her head on, knocks her off the bike. So she gets up crying, runs back to her mommy, and says, "Mommy, Mommy, Johnny hurt me." And the mom looked and said, "Johnny's not even here. He's with your dad at the hardware store." And she looked, she said, "You mean that these things can happen anytime?" And she said, "Bummer." In life, we realize that things can happen at any time. And I don't know about you, but I've learned in my life it's not a matter of what happens, it's a matter of how you react to what happens. Are we going to respond with the assurance of a believer, or are we going to find ourselves struggling in many ways? Like the young man that was graduating high school, he's filling out an application for college, and they want to know what his extracurricular activities were, and he wrote down wrestling. And then the next right was positions held, and he said pin mostly. You ever felt that way with life? Every time you think you get back up, you're going to get knocked back down, and then life seems to be running you instead of you living your life. That times we seem like it's a hopeless situation. But there's times also that something that seems to be very bad turns out to be something very good, if we will allow it to work out. You know, the one thing that I can share with you is with Rich and his stroke, that we came to a point, eventually realized that that stroke saved his life. That his heart was about to give out, and he had not had the stroke, we would have never known that. And the valve would have, and we'd had no time to get anywhere to the hospital at all. So what appeared to be a very bad thing turns out to be something very good. Is it difficult for Rich? Oh, absolutely. Is it difficult for Dad? Always will be. Always will be. But he's alive. You know, the doctor asked me once, said, "How would you like to see Rich after this?" I said, "Alive. And we'll deal with everything else. We'll be able to adjust, and things are going well." But there's times that it seems to be a hopeless situation. There was a fleet of ships that were sailing out to fish up in the northeast, and they got into this horrible storm. And they got kicked around so badly they weren't sure exactly where they were at. And in the midst of all of that, when they went back home, this one family's house caught on fire. And all the men were fishermen, so they weren't there, and nobody was really there to help when the house burnt down. So, and a day or two later, the ships came sailing back into the harbor. And everybody was glad, except this one lady walked up to her husband, and she said, "I'm sorry about our house burnt down." And he looked at his husband, and the husband looked at his wife and said, "I thank God for that fire, because it was the light of the fire that showed us which direction to go to be able to get back home." Things can really look like they're bad, and sometimes they are. That's one of the things we're going to talk about here, but that we can look and see, what do Christians know? I can tell you, dealing with families and anybody that has dealt in these situations with the death of a family or whatever, a crisis of some kind, there is a world of difference between Christians and non-Christians. The reaction, you can just see it as you're there visiting with the people and trying to help them, that when they are Christians, there's a peace there that you don't find anywhere else. The non-Christians can say whatever they want, but yet it's missing. You can see the fear that is there, and otherwise isn't as far as the Christians are concerned. How many of you know who Lisa Beamer is? Janet, you do? Yep. Shh. You can keep it right there. If I showed you this, would you know who these other people is? See, we forget. It'd be, what, 13 years ago now. That Todd Beamer was on an airplane, commercial flight 93, United Flight 93, on his way wherever they were going, and got turned around. And from what I understand, the idea was the hijackers were going to go to the White House and run this plane crashing into the White House on September 11th of 2009. And when they realized that Todd Beamer was one of the main guys, they decided they were going to take over that plane. It was going to crash. It crashed, what, Pennsylvania, I believe? It was going to crash. It was going to cost them their lives. But the last thing that Lisa Beamer heard from her husband over the cell phone was what? Let's roll. Let's roll. And then afterwards, Lisa Beamer began to speak about her husband, about the tragedy. And people were just overwhelmed by the fact that she was so positive with this, that her faith had come to the surface. And you read that book, and you listen to some of the things she said, it's almost amazing how this lady responded to this great, great tragedy in her life. Okay? What does she know? How can she react that way? Okay? We're going to talk about, as Christians, what we know for sure, that will allow us to react in life the way God would intend for us to do that. So I'll have Robin, if you would come and read Romans chapter 8, verse 26 through 39. I'm sorry, 28 through 39.
And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son, that He might be firstborn among many brothers. And those He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He also justified. Those He justified, He also glorified. What then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for all of us, how will He not also, along with Him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who is he that condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord.
You notice as Paul is writing these things, he uses words like, I know, I'm convinced, I'm certain. That is what we need to look at as Christians to understand. The first thing that Paul says to us, verse 28, the title that we want to give to it. Anybody have a suggested title?
More than conquerors.
Pardon me?
More than conquerors.
Okay, more than conquerors. Verse 37, I believe it is. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Anybody else? Yes, Scott.
Nothing can separate us from Christ.
Okay, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Okay? What do you think Paul is trying to teach us here? I'm going to mention this later in the sermon. Do you know what I think he's trying to tell us? It's time for Christians to quit acting like losers. We've won. We have won. We are on the winning side. If God is for us, who can be against us? Who can successfully keep us from accomplishing God's will? That instead of cowering over in the corner and being afraid of Ebola or whatever the case may be, and it used to be AIDS, and we can just go on nuclear war, every generation's had its own. I refuse to live in fear. Whatever might happen, I refuse to live in that fear. That I'm not going to be over in the corner afraid all the time. Why? Why? Because we won. We are more than conquerors, and we need to look at what Paul is sharing with us here as we look at this statement. So when we get to, I want to go back. Does that look like anybody you know? The certainty. Paul writes that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. It is always dangerous when I have an object list. I got up this morning, I was hungry, didn't have time to eat supper or breakfast this morning. So I decided I'm going to make a cake. And this is the only place I got to. You guys may want to move. So what are some of the ingredients that we would have in cake? I've got some flour here. Hopefully, Ron Joanne, it doesn't fall off the table on the carpet. And then I have some sugar here. And then we got some salt here. And then I've got some cinnamon here. And right now the ladies are saying, what kind of cake is he making? I have imitation vanilla flavoring. I've got some food coloring. I've got some icing. I've got some baking soda. And evidently a cinnamon cake because I got some more cinnamon. I need a volunteer to come up here and drink this vanilla. Anybody? I know you would. Talk to this girl. Okay, if not, who would like to come up and eat a mouthful of flour? You want to, don't you? Joey says, come up there, try it. My point is this, that if we take all these ingredients and we put it together, we bake it, we're going to have a very, very delicious cake. Not if I make it, but for normal people. I think that what I'm trying to illustrate here, there are going to be things that happen in our lives that aren't good. This verse never says everything is good. It says that God causes everything to work for the good. So these ingredients are not going to be, I don't know how many of you have eaten a mouthful of flour. I don't think that's going to be. Well, I'm not even getting in that. For everybody don't marry and pull our hats. Yeah, that was when you were in treatment, right? Anyway, maybe that's why you went into treatment, I don't know. Okay? But sometimes there's going to be things in life that separately are not going to be good. But God causes all things to work together for good. That He can mix all this together in the right recipe, and that we have to have that understanding. Paul says we know that. We know that. So the question then is, what is the meaning of the word good? Now, before you answer that, stop and think, because your answer may very well indicate to you your selfishness. So what does good mean? Now you're afraid to answer it. Yes, strange looking boy up there at the top. Not Mark, but Gabriel. Okay, you're at the end.
The work of God.
The Word of God? Okay. How are you doing on your sermon outline, your notes?
Right now I have guidance on it together.
When you say it's not worth writing down, is that what you said?
Maybe.
Maybe? Okay. Gabriel was to write down my sermon notes for his class over at St. Paul's. He's looking for a better preacher, you know. What does it mean? Pardon me? Delicious. Okay, that's coming from heaven. Anybody? Pardon me? Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know whether to rejoice or get mad because that was the next 10 minutes of my sermon. Okay. No. There's the key. Okay? So, because see, the next question is, what is God's desire for me in this life? Have you ever spent much time wondering that? What is God's desire for me? Now, Danny, it is the image of Christ. He's not here to make me happy. He's not here to make me wealthy. That's not His will for our lives. If it is, then we're to use that to accomplish His will. We get a lot of, I don't know if they're still continuing this, but years ago, the lady that ran Phillips 66 Petroleum, Phillips Petroleum, every year redid the parking lot and the grounds of Ozark Christian College for free. They blacktopped it, all that. Okay? So if God has given me those gifts, I'm going to use them for Him, not for myself. For Him, what He wants me to do with that. But for most of us, that's not going to be the case. I've never met very many people in my life that would confess that they were rich, no matter how much money they had. Just, well, I'm not rich, don't, that kind of deal, okay? But His desire for my life is for me to conform to the image of His Son. That's what He's working for. Many times I've prayed to God that I don't care what it takes, get my sons in heaven. I don't care what you have to do. And that's a scary prayer, but that's my desire. I've told my boys, I want you in heaven with me. Outside of that, I really have no great desire at all, as far as my life is concerned. Okay? So His desire is for me to conform to the image of His Son. That's what He wants for me. It's not to make me happy. It's not to make me wealthy. It's to make me more like Jesus. That's what He wants. He's working in every situation. It doesn't matter what you're going through. As a Christian, He is working for the good. He's got something planned. It doesn't matter what we're going through at this moment. I'll have a story for you at the end that will understand what is going on here. God's plan for us is bigger than the problems that we have. Who has Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14? Here's Paul in prison, unjustly in prison, and he writes to the Philippians about being in prison.
Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear.
So what does Paul say? I'm in prison. It's not a good place to be. But ultimately, what has it done? It's caused the gospel to spread. Okay? Caused the gospel to spread. So what I'm going through, not that big a deal, is what he's basically saying, because there's a lot of good that have come out of that. And he knows that to be true. William Cooper, that's how you pronounce his name. He's a very a Christian man. He's written a lot of Christian hymns, but he also was a man that had a lot of times of depression and despair. And there was a particular time that he decided to end his life. It was a foggy night. He called a carriage to come and get him, a horse-drawn carriage to come and get him and take him to the London Bridge, where he planned to jump off that bridge and end his life. Well, the carriage came, and they traveled for quite some time, and finally they stopped, and the driver admitted to William Cooper that in this fall he was lost. Didn't know where he was at. So Cooper got upset, got out of the carriage, and said, I'll walk and find it myself. And he took 3 steps, and you know what he found? His house. They'd been going in circles this whole time. And at that moment, he decided that God's will for him was to turn this over to God, not to jump in the river. And he wrote these words that night. How many times have we heard these words? Okay? That we have to understand that what we're going through, God is still working. We know that God causes all things to work together for the good. How do I know that verse 28 is true? Because of verse 29 and 30. That He has this plan for us, as if it's already happened. That God causes all things to work for good, but for whom does He cause all things to work for good? There's 2 qualifications here that Paul describes for us. Who is it that God works for the good? Okay, right? That's got our own translation. You're right. But what does the verse say? For those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. Okay? That He works all things together for good for those who love Him and who are desiring to live His will out in their lives. How many times I've heard people say, well, Joe, everything always works out, doesn't it? And my answer is no, it doesn't. I've seen too many situations it didn't work out for what's best. Okay? So it's for those that love Him that He is working. That the promise is for those people to live God's purpose. And when I live out God's purpose, I see God's perspective in this. I see my mindset has changed. What does that mean, mindset? We hear that a lot anymore. And basically what we're talking about is that if I have a faith in Christ, it affects every area of my life. It changes the way I think, it changes the way I talk, it changes the way I act all the time. All the time, because I have a whole different idea, a whole different setup of what life is really about. And that is what God wants for us. Example, who has Genesis chapter 50, verse 20? This is Joseph talking. Jacob is about to die, his dad is about to die. And I don't know if you know the story of Joseph, but his brothers sold him into slavery. He went into Egypt, went through all kinds of problems, and eventually saved the country because of his godliness. So when this is brought up at the end of Jacob's life, here are the words that Joseph shares.
You intended to harm me, but God intended it for the good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.
Okay. The brothers intended it for what? To harm him. In fact, all but Reuben wanted him dead. And they finally just sold him into slavery. But after all this is over, you know, we can't spend a lot of time on this, but the whole problem is that Dad's dying. And if Dad dies, then Joseph's got free rein to do whatever he wants to us. And what did we try to do to him? But then Joseph says, no, it's okay. It's okay. You meant to harm me, but God turned it around. He used it for good. Because if Joseph had not ever gone to Egypt, the whole family is dead because of the famine. So that when we look at that, that's in the book of Genesis, one of the most interesting passages of the Bible about the providence of God, about God's sovereignty, how He rules over all things. Okay? Who has Acts chapter 8? I think it's 1 through 4, is it? I've got it a little bit different here. This is Stephen. He gets into the argument with the Jewish leaders. They stone him to death. And what happens is what we see in verse 8.
On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And all, except the apostles, were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went.
So if it hadn't been for Stephen's death and the persecution, the Christians would have never left Jerusalem. And then we see this big revival. In fact, we'll see a big shift from Jerusalem to Antioch as the church continues to grow. So He takes this death of Stephen, and God uses it for good. Was it good for Stephen? No. But it's good for the whole picture here. That's what we have to look at. It's good for the gospel message being shared with us. He speaks with the support. And that is summed up very, very quickly. God is for us. And what I want to do right now is just 4 or 5 slides I've got, but I want you to see those questions that Paul asks. What then shall we say in response to these things? Here's what God has done for us. He's working for us. What's our response to these things, he asks. If God is for us, who can be against us? See, I think there's times we need to sit down and just answer all of these questions. What Paul was trying to get across this. Who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all, how will He not also, along with Him, graciously give us all things? This is the one that always stops me. Why is it that after God has given us His Son, that we think God is not going to give us everything else? Graciously give us everything that we need. That's where there's a little break in our faith, isn't there? I believe God's going to get me into heaven, but I'm not sure He'd give it to me tomorrow. Okay? So if He has given us the best that He has, if I would give you $1 million, and I'm not going to do it, okay? But if I would give you $1 million, why would you be hesitant to ask me for $20? Doesn't make no sense, does it? Paul says, use common sense here. If he's given us his son, why would he think he's not going to give us everything else? And the answer is, he's going to. He is, if we will just look and see. Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? That's one of the favorite pastimes of non-Christian people, is to criticize Christians. But if God is who I stand judgment before, and he's not going to condemn me, who's going to? The answer is, no one. No one. Who then is the one who condemns? Man, no one. No one. Who shall what separate us from the love of Christ? The answer is, no one. No one. That's the support that we have here. God speaks of his protection, his promise, his forgiveness, that he gives those people who believe in him. He wants those who love him to be conformed to his image, to become like Christ, allow the Spirit to lead us in a way that he can do that for us. And then in verse 37 to 39, he's going to talk about the security. We are not exempt from suffering. We are not. Just because we're Christians. We used to call that the hell of a well gospel. That if you are a Christian, you're never going to get sick. You're going to have all kinds of money. Jeanette Wesley is going to put $10,000 a week in my bank account. Well, was I supposed to go something like that? Our experience is that's not the way it happens, is it? And you know what that sets us up for? That I dealt with a lot of people through the years with this. That if my life doesn't go perfectly after I become a Christian, it's my fault. I feel guilty. I must not be doing something. You don't have enough faith, Georgia. And then we get this guilt complex, but we understand that's not the truth. That's not the way it goes. But in the midst of this, what does Paul write in verse 37? No, we are more than conquerors to him who loved us. The word is are, A-R-E, present tense. It's not something way down the road that we're going to look at right now. We are more than conquerors to him who loved us. And as I said earlier, it's time for us to quit acting like losers. We're winners. We have the God of the universe on our side. He is there, warning very badly to help us. That God is not going to invest in a losing cause. Okay? We're not a losing cause. Ours is not a losing. We go for all of us. We're not a losing cause. He's investing in winners only. And that's us, because we've put our faith and our trust in his Son, Jesus. We are of great value to God. I think it's important for us to understand that. I just happen to have a $20 bill. Just like I happen to have all those ingredients in my life. Who would like to have this $20 bill? Nobody? Okay, I'll just go that way. No. Not a chance in the world. Now, if you're honest, everybody's going to raise their hand. Everybody's taking a $20 bill. Now, Gabriel was going to fall off the stage. So be careful. Now, who wants it? Gabriel's going to want it. Whose kid is that? Now who wants it? Me! The point being here that no matter what happened to this $20 bill, its value is not lessened. And folks, I don't care what you've been through in your life. Your value to God is not lessened. You can be beat up by sin, you can be crumpled up, you can be stomped on by Satan, but your value is staying as it always has. What's your value to God? $20. The Son's life. $20. Who says that? Now I know where Gabriel gets it from here. That my value is still as much as everything. And how I can term my value is that who did God give for me? The Son of God died so that I might have that opportunity, that salvation. Have you ever heard these two people? One of the greatest stories that I have ever heard in my life. I just read it just a few days ago. In 1921, David and Savea Flood decided to leave their home in Sweden to go to what we would know as the Congo. Years ago in Africa, it's called Zaire now. and to be missionaries there. And they had a 2-year-old son that they did with them, and they got together with another family called, their last name was Erickson, and they wanted to take the gospel to these remote areas. And when they got to this village where they were going to work at, the chief refused to let them into the village. That he was afraid it would alienate the other gods that they worshiped, so they wouldn't allow them even to live in the village. So they went about a half a mile away, they built huts to live in, and that's where they began to hope and pray that God would open the doors up for them to come in and to work in this village, but it never happened. Never happened. The only contact that they had was this little African boy that came twice a week and sold them chickens and eggs. And they weren't allowed to speak to anybody else. Okay? So they decided, if this is the only African person that I can speak to, I'm going to try to win him to Jesus. Okay? And she began to talk to him when he came those 2 times a week. And eventually she succeeded. He became a Christian. But no one else came to listen to what they were saying. They were there for quite some time, and finally they all began to suffer from malaria. It struck all of them. And the Ericksons left the huts and went back to a bigger town to try to get some kind of help with malaria, but David and Sabe stayed there with their 2-year-old son. And in the process of time, Sabe became pregnant, and she gave birth to a little girl. And 17 days later, Sabe died. And David came. He took the little girl that he had named Ania back to the mission and gave it to the Ericksons. So I can't take care of this baby. I've lost my wife. I'm going back to Sweden. God has ruined my life. And he left. And it wasn't but 8 months later that the Ericksons got sick and they died. And they gave this little girl to some American missionaries. And eventually the missionaries left Africa and they took Ania back to the United States. And that's where she grew up. They changed her name to Aggie or Maggie. Aggie it was. So Aggie grew up in the United States. She went to a Bible college up in Minnesota. And in the process of time, she met a young man named Dewey Hurst, who was a Christian minister, and he eventually became the president of a Bible college out in Seattle, Washington. And one day, in her mail, she received this Swedish magazine. She couldn't read it. She had no idea what it said. But as she begins to look through this magazine, she comes to this picture that stops her in her tracks. It's a picture of a crude grave and a white cross in the middle of Africa. And she looks, and on that cross it says, Savea, her mom. And she is just overwhelmed by that. So she takes the magazine to somebody at the Bible college that can read the language for her. And as they're reading through it, she said, tell me, what does it talk about? She said, it talks about these 2 white families that went to Africa. And they all died. But this one woman had a little girl. And then she had talked to this one little African boy about Jesus. And eventually he became a Christian. But all the white people, all the missionaries left, the article says, and this little boy went into the village and convinced this chief to let him build a school for all the other kids. And the chief gave in, and he let him build it. And then, as a young man, he began to teach them about Jesus. And every child in that village became a Christian, and their parents followed suit and became a Christian. And even the chief of that city, that village, became a Christian. And eventually they had 600 people. Every person in this village was a Christian. She couldn't get over that. On the 25th wedding anniversary, the Bible college gave Dewey and Aggie a trip back to her home country of Sweden. And she was determined that she was going to find her father. Well, she did. Okay? He was much older now. He was about 73 years old. He had got married again and had 4 children. And she wanted to find him, and she found the children and talked to them and said, yes, I think that he's had a stroke, so he doesn't understand a lot. But the one thing you can't do is you cannot mention God to him because then he becomes irate. So she finds where he's living at. She goes into the room where he's at. He's got his back to the door. And Aggie says, Papa? And he turns around and he begins to cry. Oh, Annie, I never meant to give you away. I'm so sorry. My life has been ruined by alcohol now, and I'm just a drunk. And I'm sorry. And she said, no, Papa, it's okay because God took care of me. And then when she said God, he just went like this. But she began to talk to him. And she said to her, God has forgot us all. I live this life I have because of him. And she said, no, Papa, we didn't go to Africa in vain. Mom didn't die in vain. That whole village became Christian after we left. That seed that you planted just kept growing and growing because you were faithful. Faithful. Papa, Jesus loves you. He's never hated you. And all this has not been in vain. A few years later, the Hearst attended an evangelism school in London, England. And there was a report from the leader of the churches in Zaire, and he spoke of all what God was doing in Zaire and all of the great blessings they have received. And there were over 110,000 believers. This has been back about 1970. 110,000 believers just in Zaire alone. So when Aggie hears that, she wants to talk to this man and see all that was going on. And she goes back to him and asks if she could talk to him. And she said, have you ever heard of Savannah flood? And he looks at her and says, I'm the little boy that sold chicken and eggs to them before you were ever born. And he became this great leader of the churches in Africa. In fact, I want you to come back to Zaire. I want you to see your mom's grave because she has become one of the most honored women in our country. Now, wouldn't that be a marvelous story for people to tell about us? That it wasn't in vain. That it didn't look like God was doing anything, but look what God had done. 110,000 people have become Christians because of her mom talking to a little 7-, 8-year-old boy about Jesus when he was selling chicken and eggs. Well, it can't. Folks, our lives are not in vain if we meet those two criteria. What are they? Love God and desire to do his will in our lives. And our lives are not in vain. God is working. He is working. Is following God, is loving God, a real important part of your life. In fact, I would go as far as saying is at the very center of your life. Because I believe that's what it's going to take for us to go to heaven. To love him with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to obey him because of that love that we have for him. And I think it would be neat someday for all of us that somebody would be telling this story about us and the great, great seeds that we have planted for the gospel. Our hymn of invitation this morning is Through It All. We will find hymn number 304 in our hymn. And time goes along with the sermon, even though we never talk about it. But we're going to stand and sing so we can understand that through it all, God has been with us.